saying that their talks in Saudi Arabia to establish that, but it's very uncomfortable for Ukraine because the Ukrainian president had made clear that what he wanted to happen was for, first of all, there to be high-level talks between Ukraine and the United States, then between Ukraine and Russia, and then between Ukraine and the EU or the Europeans, and then for all of those sides to establish a united position. Before then, there were talks with Russia. The fact that the US has decided to go ahead and speak directly to Russia anyway, that is the problem, I think, here. However, we are where we are. The fact is, Donald Trump, he's the leader of the most powerful country on earth. He's clearly making that strength known and doing it his way. So for the Ukrainians, they really just have to watch what unfolds in Saudi Arabia. And the fact that Trump's envoy for Ukraine is going to be coming here to Kyiv tomorrow, he is going to be holding talks with Volodymyr Zelensky. That's clearly an indication that Ukraine is not being sidelined yet. And so the hope remains that they will have that key seat at the table. They say they have to have a seat at the table, otherwise no deal will ever work. For the Prime Minister, I imagine, is that rather than a groundswell of European allies all following behind him and committing to send their soldiers to help protect any security line over here in Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire, you've had instead division and different messages from countries. Poland signalling they weren't that keen, Spain saying they weren't that keen, the French, who have very much been forward-leaning in the idea of boots on the ground, not coming out straight away and saying they'll do the same. And then as well, the Prime Minister just stating the obvious, that no peacekeeping force in this country is going to deter Russia unless the US is a part of it. And that doesn't mean American boots on the ground necessarily. It could just be, well, not just, it could be American ships in the waters around this country, American aircraft ready to deploy were Russia to try to attack. Anything that indicates that America has skin in the game, that's what's needed, according to the allies, for Vladimir Putin to be sufficiently deterred that he wouldn't just try to rearm and re-attack.
Metropolitan Detention Centre in Brooklyn awaiting trial in May on charges of sex trafficking, transportation for prostitution and racketeering with conspiracy. He denies all the allegations. We're going to be examining what each of these federal charges mean over the coming weeks.
Thank you for this time, for having this conversation.
So my first question to you is, what exactly is sex trafficking?
Well, sex trafficking at its core revolves around the use of fraud, force or coercion, to exploit people, usually for commercial sex. There's obviously also forced labor, but when you're talking about sex trafficking, there's always the commercial sexual exploitation component to that crime.
Stuff that happens on a smaller scale inside intimate relationships.
Absolutely. So when we're thinking about sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation, and we're talking about domestically, we're looking at what we call boyfriending or romance or seduction. They pinpoint the vulnerabilities. There can be a person who has, and everybody's vulnerabilities are different. Some people's are money. Some people is the way they value themselves, their esteem, what their family dynamics are, their friendship dynamics are, or lack of. When it happened to me, I was super vulnerable. I was super insecure. I didn't like how I looked. I didn't like how I dressed. I didn't like my family. I didn't like anybody or anything. And so when this person came along and told me how beautiful I was and that I didn't have to stay with my family anymore, I could live with him. I was 16. I was like a regular teenager. I'm gonna be honest. I was a regular teenager. The things that I thought was like the end of the world, I look back and like, that's what all teenagers go through. I just couldn't deal with it, I guess. And so
Forces, and when something is received that might not be tangible, like we've said, surely the bulk of the evidence is then made up by witness testimony?
That's right. In most of these cases, the primary evidence are the witnesses who take the stand and tell the jury about exactly what happened to them. And they're subject, in many instances, to really significant cross cases, it comes down to whether or not the jury believes, I was going to say women, but it can be men as well, but for the jury to believe the individual who says that she has been or he has been trafficked in some way.
Forced labour, remind me, was that the only charge?
He was charged with operating a racketeering enterprise in connection with he committed various types of crimes, including sexual exploitation of minors and forced labor, among other acts.
One of the things that a lot of people took from that really stuck with people was the testimony of the witnesses who came up. That is a lot, as you've just said, there is a lot of pressure on witness testimony there. How on earth do you prepare somebody to speak about something in a really fragile state in such a public manner?
Yeah, witness preparation in those cases is really challenging because generally speaking, the prosecutors and law enforcement agents want to avoid re-victimizing somebody who has already gone through extraordinary trauma. But at the end of the day, in order to prove up the case, the prosecutor requires the witnesses to come in and take the stand and rehash for the jury in very vivid detail some of the worst days of their lives.
Since controversial human rights activist Malcolm X made a famous visit to Smethwick. The words he spoke while on Marshall Street had a profound impact.
Residents on the street were struggling with the number of immigrants and people moving to the area from abroad were met with a racist backlash. Pablo Taylor has been looking back at the time Malcolm X spent in the Midlands and how Marshall Street has changed since.
It would be easy to walk down this street in Smethwick without ever realising its significance. It might be quiet today, but exactly 60 years ago it was the focus of the nation's attention in a fierce row over immigration and segregation.
This row of terrace cottages, then due east for 250 yards. Looking street to have the most publicised name in Britain this week.
Faced with a growing number of black and Asian neighbours, residents here had banded together to ask the council to buy up the remaining properties and reserve them for white families.
This delegation to the council was purely to try and make a stand to stop the road completely being taken over by coloured people.
The families often speak little English.
Their movement had been fueled by derogatory claims about the habits of non-whites.
They use the back gardens for toilets. I don't think they know what the toilets are for. They're in their own little communities and